Without much further ado, it gives me great pleasure to welcome everybody here to our spring, what are we in the spring now? Spring series, the What Is. What Is. Rethinking everything we know about our universe. Can you hear me in the back? Are we good? Great, okay. So, what's most important to know is that just as we begin, I want to challenge you to think about what exactly is the extent of your relationship with God. Think about it a moment. What kind of relationship do you have with God? And the context in which I ask you this question is, imagine I ask you the same question about your spouse. What kind of relationship do you have with your spouse? Would you be willing to answer the first question the way you're going to answer the second question? Many of us about the first question would say, well, it's funny you use the word relationship. I don't really see it as such. I'm not even sure if I believe that he exists. Right? Hey, Mark. I'm not even sure if I believe that God exists. That might be the first answer to the first question. But you wouldn't be able to say that about the second question. My spouse? I'm not even sure if I already have a spouse. Is she there? Is she not there? Does she exist? Does she not exist? Do I agree with how she did this or that and the other? It's not really part of the conversation. When it comes to your spouse, you love and accept them even when you disagree. Yet when it comes to God, we say, well, because of the Holocaust, therefore there's no God, therefore I have no relationship. It doesn't really make sense. You can't really make that connection. Yes, you can't. It's not logical. You can't say that just because I disagree with Donald Trump, therefore he doesn't exist. That you agree with, yeah?
I wish you did.
As much as you wish that was true, you can't. David, nice to see you. Hello. That's David from the Gulf, right?
Yeah.
Beautiful. Welcome, David. And this is?
Susie.
Susie, nice to meet you, Susie. I'm Rabbi Vigler.
Hi.
Welcome. Hey, Charlotte.
No, there was not room. Too many chairs.
Charlotte, right here. He's open for you if you want. These are the more expensive seats in the front row.
I was wondering.
So, my point is that when it comes to our relationships, we want to feel an emotion. That's what you want in a relationship. With a child, with a parent, with a lover, with a spouse, you want to feel an emotion. But the only way that you're able to reach emotion is by starting off with intellect. Human beings were created vertical, where our brain is above our heart. Because what we understand in our brain becomes an emotion. Animals, horizontal, are more impulsive. They're instinctive. They're not mindful. You don't see animals making plans for their financial future, because they don't work like that. They're just instinctive and impulsive. They eat, drink, sleep, and procreate when they want. But as humans, if we're trying to deepen our relationship with ourselves, with the universe, with God, we need to first be able to think deeply and understand deeply about, intellectually, what goes on in the universe around us. When we reach that intellectual clarity, it's then that emotions will start to be born. If the extent, put us in another perspective, if the extent of your godly research is realistically 5 seconds that you've put into the thought process, as in, because of the Holocaust, therefore I don't believe in God, if that's the extent of your relationship, it's going to be very difficult to sire an emotion. But if you've thought deeply about existence, the universe, creation, being, presence, purpose, if you've been through all that, if you've spent time thinking about God and learning about God, it's then that you're going to be able to develop a true relationship. And this is the unique contribution to the world of Chabad philosophy. What Chabad means, I've said this many times before, Chabad is an acronym for wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. It is an unapologetic and relentless intellectual attack on faith. It's an intellectual attack on faith. When you're able to understand God, it's then that you're able to feel. And that's where we're trying to go in our discussion today. Before we begin, I'd like to launch with this brief video presentation. You can't hear. Okay, we're having an audio problem here today. In the back you can't hear. Is that because of the noise outside?
No, it's too low.
It's too low. Okay, you know what? I'm going to skip the video. Forget it. We'll try to work it out next week. So, here's what I'm going to say. Descartes spoke about, I think, therefore I am. What does that mean? He spoke of the evil demon. The evil demon is some sort of a demon that maybe was creating the projection of everything around him. That everything around him was really just a smoke screen. It was just fake by this evil demon. And the only thing that I know for sure exists is my rational mind. That's what he meant when he said, I think, therefore I am, because I'm not sure if anything really exists unless I can understand it. I think, therefore I am. That's what he said. What this video is trying to portray is Plato's man in a cave, similar concept, where you see this guy, these people are watching the shadows in the cave, and all that the people can see is the shadows in the cave, but they can't see, their backs are turned. They cannot see who's making those shadows. So they, in their mind's imagination, they try to interpret what these shadow figures are, but they don't really know what they're seeing. So Plato was trying to give an example of how what we see might not be real. A more modern example of this is the brain in a jar analogy, where a modern scientist, I forget his name, speaks about a brain which is in a jar connected to a supercomputer, which can simulate the feeling of walking in the park, the feeling of going to your sister's wedding, the feeling of eating a rib steak. You're not really experiencing any of it. But the brain is wired to the computer to let it feel all those emotions and feelings. How do we know that the world we live in is actually happening? How do we know that this is actually real? And that's a discussion we're going to have today, which is the angle of Torah. What does the Torah have to, what wisdom does the Torah have to share with us about the existence of the universe, the existence of anything, the existence of ourselves, and what profoundly meaningful message that conclusion can have with us in our daily struggles? When we will reinterpret our perception of ourselves and of the universe, how that's going to change our attitude and response to challenge and struggle. We begin, so here's the question. How do we know? Do you see this? How do we know that what we think is real? You see this? That looks, right? A nice field. It looks very real. Can you see David and Susie? Yeah, I don't block you. So how do we know that what we think is real is really real? How do I know that I'm not looking at a computer screen? There was a Chinese philosopher who spoke about that he dreamt once of a butterfly. And then he wondered, I can't pronounce his name. He wondered if he is a philosopher, a Chinese philosopher who's dreaming of being a butterfly, or maybe he's a butterfly dreaming of being a Chinese philosopher. The Torah tells us as follows. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. You can see this text for yourself on page 3 of your textbook. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth, which seems pretty much straightforward, where the Torah tells us that the world certainly exists. I think someone's looking for us. It looks pretty straightforward, right? But a further research into the Torah shows us yet another verse in the 5th book of the Torah that says, you have been shown to know that God is God. There is nothing else besides Him. There is nothing else besides God. So we've got a problem here between these two verses. How do we reconcile, on the one hand, God created heaven and earth, at the same time to say that nothing really exists other than God? Before we really continue, we need to just take a moment to define reality. What is the definition of reality? So the dictionary states the state of things as they actually exist, as opposed to an idealistic or notional idea of them. In other words, it's an objective reality. It's not my opinion of reality. It's something which is unique. It's as it is, not just what I think it is. That's how the dictionary defines reality. It's absolute, self-sufficient. The key word here, I think, is objective. It's not subjective to human decisions. Because the truth is that the way we look at the world around us is more often subjective than it is objective. Give you a quick example. A and B, squares A and B. Do they look the same?
No.
What's the difference?
Different color.
Colors, okay. This is actually a famous optical illusion. Because A and B are exactly the same color. Can you see why? Let me show you. It's the surrounding that confuses you, because watch what's going to happen now. As you look at it, this may or may not work for your eyes. It depends. Your eyes are actually playing tricks with you. When you look at that long enough, I'm looking at it right now, and to me A and B are exactly the same color. Anybody else see that? Right? It's fascinating, because before Randy was absolute that they're different colors, but you watch, it's changing with you. You watch. Give it a few seconds, and it's actually going to change slowly, because your mind is telling you that they're different colors. But if you let yourself go and you see this as an objective image, objective to whatever you saw before, it might not actually work. But for some people in the room, I know that it worked, right? You saw that. I see it right now. For me, it's exactly the same color. But it's an optical illusion. I mean, I don't have to tell you about optical illusions. To define reality, we need to work on critical thinking. To be able to differentiate between our perception and what is. And what really objectively is. We can conclude, preliminarily, that perception has got nothing to do with reality, number one. Number two, we have to accept it as it is. And if you want to develop antibiotics or airplanes, it's not going to help you, your perception of disease or aviation. You're going to have to work with the objective reality to come up with the innovation necessary to manipulate whatever forces are at play to reach your desired result. Right? That's just the reality. There's nothing extraordinarily profound about this. Chassidic theology calls this the worldly reality. And this is indeed the world that we're familiar with. There's nothing out of the ordinary here. This is our world. It's governed by law. It's governed by nature, by limits. In fact, the word nature in Hebrew, you know how to say nature in Hebrew? Teva. Teva. You see up on top over there. The word teva in Hebrew and the lettering is T-E-V-A. See there? Well, whatever. The middle word is teva. It's actually a big pharmaceutical company in Israel. I think it's the largest pharmaceutical in the world. I saw they have one on I-95 by... still further south, on the turnpike, a little further south. But there's financial problems I hear now. I don't know. I heard something. You work in pharmaceuticals, right? But they're one of the biggest in the world. They have a whole mountain in Jerusalem that they're on, an entire mountain. It's quite fascinating. But the word teva, which means nature, also means embedded or imprinted. It means predictable. That's what nature is. The sun rises every morning and it sets every evening. Babies are born this way and people pass that way. It's just the nature of things is the predictability of things. That's what the very word nature means in Hebrew. Not only is this observable to our eyes, but even the Torah testifies to this as well. The Torah also tells us that this is reality. The Torah tells us, if you look at text number 4, that God does not change the rules. Text number 4, one of the great commentaries on the Torah, the Ran, he says as follows: God's desire and will is to maintain the way of the world wherever possible. Nature is precious in God's eyes, and He doesn't change it unless it's absolutely necessary. not only is God very reluctant to break the laws of nature, but even when what's happening is opposed to his own will. Even when somebody's doing something really bad, God still doesn't change the laws of nature. Just carry on in text number 5, where the Talmud says, this is from the Talmud, suppose a person stole a measure of wheat and went and sowed it in the ground. It's stolen wheat. Should it be decreed that it not grow because there was theft? Rather, the world follows its natural course, and the fools who act wrongly will be held accountable. Suppose a person has relations with his neighbor's wife. Should it be decreed that she should not conceive? Rather, the world follows its natural course, and the fool who acted wrongly will be held accountable. So God doesn't change the rules. Even when a guy like Hitler gets up there and he starts killing innocent men, women, and children, God doesn't say, this is not acceptable, I'm going to stop it. He doesn't get involved. He doesn't want to get involved. And I'm not going to get into a whole discussion about the Holocaust right now, because that would totally hijack the conversation. But at least when it comes to the context of the laws of nature, the Torah testifies too that the laws are hard and fast, and they don't change even when they conflict with his will. So not only is that a scientific principle, but it's also a religious principle that the laws of nature are real. And this is why, up until modern times, scientists had developed a deterministic view of the universe. Deterministic, where we can basically predict what's going to happen with enough information. We know what's going to happen because of these laws that are limited, hard and fast. You do A plus B equals C. With enough equations, enough scientific chemistry, physical research, we can come to a nice predictability of the universe. And it's a nice place to be, because it allows us to feel in control, and possibly even to almost predict the future. This is a nice aspiration to reach. But there's a problem with it. There's actually two problems. Two problems with this deterministic view of the universe, of the world. You see, the problem is that modern science has proved the contrary. That the world is not fixed in any way whatsoever. If you're familiar with something called chaos theory, or even from the 1920s, there's Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which basically tells us that we didn't even know on a very molecular level, on the atomic level. We don't even know where the electrons even are at any moment in time. Where there's uncertainty in all aspects, and nothing, absolutely nothing is for sure. So modern science has shown us that as much as we want to define reality as that which is objectively true and limited and defined, we realize that we can't. Because modern science has revealed to us that we can't, nothing is fixed. Nothing is, the world is constantly changing on the atomic level. So that's why we can't predict what's going to happen. We can't predict what the weather is going to be like. We'll never be able to predict what the weather is going to be like, because that is the nature of the universe, as modern science has discovered. There's one more problem here with a deterministic view that everything is predictable, and that is philosophically speaking. Philosophically, this would preclude us from having any freedom of choice. It would mean that everything is predetermined. We can never be held accountable. There's no such thing as reward or punishment. There's mitzvahs, there's sins. None of this is at play. Everything is predetermined. We'll have a whole discussion on that later in the series about free choice versus God's foreknowledge of everything. And that's a fascinating discussion. Absolutely mind-blowing. But for the introductory purposes of today, King David, in the book of Psalms, speaks about the gods of gold and silver. He speaks about idolatry, and he says that this approach, that everything is is predetermined, everything is fixed in the universe, that itself is actually idolatrous. Take a look at page 11 at the textbook here. It says, their idols are silver and gold, the handiwork of man. They have a mouth, but they do not speak. They have eyes, but they do not see. They have ears, but do not hear. A nose, but they do not smell. He's talking about the idols. They have hands, but they don't feel. They have feet, but they don't walk. They don't communicate with their throats. Like them shall be those who make the idols, all who trust in them. Those who believe in the laws of nature being deterministic in their fate. Israel, however, doesn't trust in nature. Israel trusts in God. He is their help and their protector. So, to illustrate this point, we reach a point now where we would like to embrace a view of the world, a worldly reality, a world which is governed by laws, which is deterministic and clearly defined, an objective reality. But we've got a problem, because the world is not really objectively defined at all. When we realize that the world is so fluid, the world is so viscous, it's so constantly changing, we're forced to ask ourselves, then what then is reality? We're forced to go back to Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Or Plato's man in the cave. Or the brain in the jar. Which says, 1 second, what actually does exist? What actually is? What really is? If everything's constantly changing, and the definition of reality is that which doesn't change, that which is objectively not determined by the viewer, but that which is in and of itself, then what is reality? I want to ask you this challenge. If you could please turn to page 12, you'll see 9 dots. You'll see 9 dots. And the goal here is to draw 4 lines, 4 connected lines that cover all the dots. You've got to draw 4 lines that are touching one another that cover all the dots. Just take a moment, try to work it out. If you know it, then you know it. But if you don't, check it out.
Only 4 straight lines.
4 straight lines that are connected to each other that cover all 9 dots. You can't lift your pen from the paper. Thank you. Any luck, anybody? 4 lines. I know you know it. There's 4 lines. You can't lift your pen off the paper. And you've got to cover all the dots. Oh boy. Okay. All right, so do your answers look anything like this? Here we got the 9 dot challenge. Anybody got it? Let's see what you got. Well, show me what you did. Okay, does your answers look anything like this? Anybody got this one? That one? That one? Whichever way you go, you're going to miss a dot. Here's the answer. Ready for the answer? Did you do that yourself?
I know it. But
Oh, you know it. Okay, good.
You gotta think out of the box.
So here's the answer. Watch. You ready? There it is. It's a famous example. It's a famous example of what happens when we lock ourselves in a box. Typically, when people see this question, they automatically assume that the 9 dots are in a box. And that's why you couldn't solve the problem. You think you have to work in the box. Did anybody tell you that there was a box here? Nobody said there was a box. It wasn't drawn in the picture. There's no box. The only way you can do this is by thinking out of the box. The problem here is not... What?
Did you figure it out without knowing the answer? It's hard.
No, I didn't.
Right? It's like...
No. So the problem in this figure, in this exercise, the problem isn't the puzzle. The problem here isn't the puzzle. The problem is your self-imposed limitations. And that's what happens when we view reality only from our limited perspective. What I'd like to do today is to take this out of the box. To see a different perspective on the universe. If you ask someone about a house, what is a house? What is a house? Any answers? What is a house?
Dwelling.
You have a beautiful house, a magnificent piece of architecture. So an architect is going to tell you, wow, this is a unique, magnificent, novel piece of architecture. But if you ask the builder is going to tell you it is a house. You ask the homeowner will say, this represents my dreams, love, family, grandchildren. And that's what's going to happen when you speak to a scientist, or if you speak to an environmentalist. He's going to think that this is an absolute shanda, a disgrace. You chased away the crocodiles and the polar bears and the turtles, right? You see the different perspectives on the same house. It's just people looking at it from their own angles. As we try to understand what is the reality around us, when we try to find that objective, unchanging reality that is around us, modern science forces us to embrace the realization that the world is constantly changing. There's got to be something else which is a constant. There's got to be something else which is an absolute value, which is reality. Our goal today will be to discover the depth that the Torah has to share with us, with layers of depth of this reality. Specifically, we're going to go up 4 rungs of a ladder, speaking on 4 levels of depth. 4 levels of reality of the world in which we inhabit. Right now, we spoke so far of the worldly reality, which we're very familiar with. So if you look at figure 1.5a, we ask ourselves the question, page 13. We ask ourselves the question, is the world real on the level of worldly reality? And we say, yeah. The world is real on the level of worldly reality because its own limits, at least initially, are absolute. Right? Generally speaking, the airplanes all fly the same way. Medicines, generally speaking, most of the time, they work the same way. The golf swing, the aerodynamics of the cars, everything works for the most part the same way, and that's how we develop innovation. We know on a deeper molecular level we've got a problem with that. But this forces us to seek something deeper, which is a deeper reality that is at play in the universe at all times. And now for this I bring you back to that verse that we had earlier, that very first verse from the Torah, which was right here, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. When you think about that phrase, it's not much different initially to other faiths who also might believe in the creation of the universe by God. But a closer analysis tells us something very unique about the Torah approach. And that is the realization of the word created. Jewish philosophy explains to us that created means that what came before the world was created. What was the world created before the world? What was there? So in the Big Bang Theory, there was stuff. there was stuff flying around. And that stuff somehow exploded, and that became the world the way we know it. But according to Torah, God created the heavens and the earth, something from total nothing. He created it from absolutely nothing. What? Tov avo. And the Torah testifies that in 3 or 4 verses later. It says, in the beginning, he took absolutely total chaos and nothingness, and he turned it into something. Which means that everything exists only because God desired it to be that way. It's very difficult for us human beings to use the word created in our lexicon. Because when we make something, we're really taking something and turning it into something else. Taking a tree and you're turning it into a table. You're taking aluminum, you're turning it into a sink or a car. But we're not ever taking something out of nothing. That creation is something unique to God at the time of creation. And this creation mentality, the reality of creation, tells us that things are not what they seem. Things only are because God made them such. Originally they were nothing. Prior they were absolutely nothing. And that nothingness was willed by God. He desired it to turn it into something. So it only is what it is because God wanted it to be that way. It's what He made. Now, with this approach, it changes our whole Weltanschauung. When we realize this, it changes our whole perception of the universe. Take a look at text number 8, please. Page 15. We're speaking here about the birth of Isaac. Does anybody know how old Isaac's parents were when he was born in the Torah? Old. How old?
90.
Sarah was 90 and Abraham was 100. Sounds absolutely absurd. Like many of the other miracles in the Torah that just sound off the wall, ridiculous. Right? Even Sarah laughed. Yes, that's right. That's why they called him Yitzchak. They thought it was a joke when they were told that they're going to have a baby. They called him Yitzchak, which means to laugh. The miracles we read about in the Torah, they're so hard to believe. You know, the frog plague and the whole Passover story. It's very difficult to actually accept that. Take a look here, text number 8. Samson Raphael Hirsch was one of the great rabbis of Germany in the 1800s. Very, very interesting person. Here, let's see what he says. The birth of Isaac was, of course, an absolute absurdity. The notion that a 100-year-old man and his 90-year-old wife, who had never had a child in the course of their long married life, should suddenly bear a son, and to place the hopes of the whole future of mankind on this child. According to all natural conditions of cause and effect, the entire existence of the Jewish people, its history, its hopes, its expectations, must appear as the most laughable pretension. It makes sense only when it reckons on the deeply infringing, completely free almighty will of the Almighty God. If we come with the perception that the world is the way we know it, and now you're telling me about a miracle, right? Now you're telling me about a miracle, then the miracle sounds absurd. But if you come in with this perspective and you say, really there's only God. God is the only absolute value. Everything else just happened to be created by Him. He happened to create most things in a system of predictable cause and effect, which we call nature. But other things He created just the way He wants them, when He wants them, and how He wants them. When you flip the tables on our perception of reality, instead of saying that there's a world and maybe there's a God, we take it the other way around. We say, first we know that there's a God. And now we say, oh, there's also a world. With that approach, we say, okay, so now it makes sense only when it reckons on the deeply infringing, completely free almighty will of the Almighty God. And then he takes it further. That was why God waited for the first seed of this nation to be laid until the absurd old age of its ancestors. God deliberately wanted Isaac, the first Jew, to be born in the most ridiculous of circumstances. That was why He waited to fulfill His promise until all human hopes for its realization had ended. For it was a question of creating a nation which from the very beginning of its existence was to be in opposition to all the ordinary laws of history, an intimation of God in the midst of mankind. This is a profound profound concept. God deliberately wanted the first Jew born under miraculous circumstances so that to lay the foundation stone of the Jewish nation, that this is a nation that dances to the beat of a different drum. We are not subject to the laws of nature. We're not. We were born through miracles. That's what happens when your reality changes from a worldly reality to a creation reality. When God is not the novelty, but God is the absolute value. He also happened to have created a world. He created the heavens and the earth. Now we see that Isaac being born through miracles is not that absurd at all. Because the same way that God created the world, He also created miracles as well. Why not? He could create Isaac at 100 years old of his father, or 90 years old of his mother. You know, there was a whole movement it was 200 years ago, I think it was, where they said that there's not enough food in the world to sustain humanity. There's not enough food in the world to keep humanity going. So they said that the only way to do it, and it's even a movement right now, the only way to deal with it is by stopping to have kids. I guess I'm not helping the cause with my 8th child being born the other day, right? But that's a whole movement, right? So back in 200 years ago, they really were not producing enough food. But guess what happened? They invented better fertilizers. Right. They invented better fertilizers, and now we're producing 2 to 3 times more food than the world is actually necessary. Then the population of the world, I think, was 800 million. Now it's 7 billion, much, much greater. Why? Because if you look, were these guys wrong? Was that Thomas wrong? It wasn't wrong. From a worldly reality perspective, this is the way the world is going. And there's more people than there's food. There's no way we can sustain this. But when we flip our perspective and we see it from a creation reality, when we realize that God sustains the world and He'll work it out, it's then that we realize we're still here 200 years later. And now they're saying we should stop having kids because of climate change. I don't totally understand what the problem is, but apparently having too many kids is causing climate change. Right? And maybe they're right from a worldly reality. But from a creation reality, we know that if God commanded us to do something, it's not possible that it can conflict with the continuity of the universe. If your boss is telling you to work on Shabbos, or if you're forced to eat non-kosher, right? And you say, well, I need to make money. I need to keep my job. So I've got to work on Shabbos, so I've got to eat treif. That's coming from the worldly reality perspective. If you're coming from a creation reality, from a miracle mentality, you say, listen, God is in charge. Whatever He says goes. It's not possible that the fulfillment of a mitzvah can in any way conflict with the continuity of the world. So even though we don't see miracles on a daily basis, that was maybe in biblical times, we know with this approach, with this creation reality, that God is always in charge, and therefore our prayer, they got the birth of Isaac, the Exodus, all these miracles they start making sense when we see it from a creation perspective. But even we realize that we might not have miracles right now, but we know that prayer and mitzvahs will change our destiny because there's a God up in heaven who controls what's going on. The previous Chabad Rabbi, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, was hunted by the Soviets, the communists in Russia, for the crime of teaching Torah. And at one point, they finally caught him and they put a gun to his head and they said, look, if you're not going to tell us where all the secret shuls and the secret yeshivas and the secret cheters and the secret mikvahs are for us to uproot Judaism out of communist Russia, if you're not going to tell us where they are, then we have this little toy. They pulled out a gun. This little toy has made even the mute learn how to speak. So go ahead and tell us. And the Rebbe responded, he said, look, your little toy only works for those who have many gods and one world. But I have only one God, and I have two worlds. The life of this world and the life of the world to come. I subscribe to God Almighty. I will never, and therefore your toy will not work with me. And indeed he survived. He actually made it out of Russia, and Judaism thrived and survived despite all that opposition. But that's where you have a person who's exhibiting that creation reality. Someone who's not living within the worldly reality, where there's a world and maybe there's also a God. He says, no, there's a God. And this God created the world. Therefore, my fulfillment of Torah, teaching Torah in Russia, doing mitzvahs in Russia, it's not possible that it could possibly conflict with the ordinary, with the success of the world. It's not possible, because the same God that created the world is the one that commanded me to do these mitzvahs. And now, if you turn to figure 1.5b on page 16, we can answer the question on a deeper level. Does the world exist? So we've asked the question on the worldly reality. We said, does the world exist? From a worldly reality perspective, and on the screen we said yes. We said, yeah, the world exists because it's got limits and rules. Absolutely. But from a creation reality perspective, we say the world is real because God created it, and God is the absolute reality. God is the absolute and unchanging value. This is a deeper perspective on the world the way we know it. Nothing's changed. We just look at the world the way we know it. We're dealing with the same North Korea, Iran, Syria, Russia, America problems. We're just looking at it from a different perspective. A person who's stuck in the worldly reality might be having a heart attack over what's going on right now in Syria. But a Jew who's stuck in the creation reality says, yeah, this is a problem. We've got issues here. But I know that there's a God in heaven. In the same way, this is not in the hands of Putin or Khomeini or Bashar Assad. There's a God who's overseeing all of this. And that God is the one who's going to make sure that it ends up okay. So the Jew from the creation reality perspective has got a totally different emotional response to what's going on in Syria or worldly affairs right now. And that applies to your personal problems as well. God forbid somebody who might commit suicide over financial problems might be stuck in worldly reality because he figures there's no way for me to get out of this. But the one who's in the creation reality says, no, I might be having problems. But through prayer and through mitzvahs and through my connection to God, I can and will change this. God will get me out of this because He's in control. Which leads us to our third, yet even a deeper perspective. The creation reality tells us, by definition, that there is a God who created the world. Yes, Martin.
Of course, the challenge is coming back to the Holocaust again.
Okay.
With creation reality.
Yes.
God above created it. How could this happen?
How could what happen? I could tell you, from a worldly reality.
No, the creation reality.
Well, let me tell you this. From a worldly reality, if you want to throw in the Holocaust for a second, I'll say this. From a worldly reality perspective, Hitler should have finished us off, and there's no way that he shouldn't have. He should have stopped. There's no explanation whatsoever why Hitler didn't finish off the Jews. In fact, there's no explanation whatsoever why any other nation that persecuted us didn't finish us off. Starting from the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, and every other nation in Europe that beat us to a bloody pulp. There's no explanation whatsoever why they didn't finish that job. So when I'm speaking to a Holocaust survivor who tells me where was God, I say to him, well, you're here. How did you get here? I survived. How did you survive? And again, this is a very emotionally charged conversation about the Holocaust, but I want you to think of that perspective. That if we're on a worldly reality perspective, where dog eats dog, where the mighty subdues the weak. We were weak. We had no air force. We had no army. Nobody cared for us. Nobody wanted to even take in our immigrants, right? There's no way we could have survived that. It's only from a creation reality that God decided to change the laws of nature at the 11th hour. Why He waited that long? I have the same question. I don't know. If I was God, maybe I'd know. But I don't. But the fact that we're still here proves to me that there is a God. But again, that's a difficult conversation. So there's different perspectives at play here as we look at the universe around us. This is a little bit of an intellectual conversation, a little bit more intellectual than we might be familiar with. But you know what? It's thinking deeply. We're trying to just take a little bit longer to think a little deeply and try to see a deeper perspective of the ordinary experiences that we are so familiar with, to try to see them from a deeper perspective. So the moment we speak about God creating the universe, we speak about a creation reality, we're automatically forced to consider that, there's us looking at God, right? The creation reality is us saying, God created us, so God is in charge. But if we step into God's shoes for a second, I wonder how He sees the world, and that's going to be the godly reality. That's going to be the godly reality that we're going to introduce in a moment. When we speak of creation, we said earlier that God created the world from what?
Nothing.
Something was created from nothing. So what's something? When we say something, is the world, right? The world, the way we know it, is something, and it's created from what? From?
Nothing.
So we're effectively saying that from God came this world, right? So something came from nothing. We're effectively saying that God is nothing. Right? We're saying that God created us. We are something. We are something. And we come from nothing.
No.
That's really what we're saying. Because we're not being disrespectful to God. It's just that because we're such finite beings, because we're so limited, imagine I told you to imagine a table which has no dimensions. I want you to imagine a table which has no dimensions, no colors. Can you imagine it? How tall, how short, how long, how wide, what color, what's it made out of? I have no idea. It's limited, it's unlimited, it's infinite. You can't imagine it. There's nothing to picture. Because we as finite human beings, whenever we think of something which is infinite, we just say, it's nothing. We can't even relate. So, there's actually two perspectives at play here. Let's take a look at this in page 17. It is written, God is the God of minds. This implies the existence of two minds, two perspectives on reality. The first mind is that God is the true reality, and all that is here below is regarded as naught, as it is nothing, but a reflection of God's reality. It is therefore called nothing. We, the creations, are called nothing. God is something, and He created us nothings. As was explained in an earlier discourse, regarding the meaning of the verse, there is nothing else. Remember we said in the beginning of the class, we said there is nothing else besides for God? God is the only thing that exists, and everything else is nothing. This is God's mind. This is from God's perspective. There's only God. But the second mind is how we see reality. Is how it appears from the perspective of the creation. To us, it seems that we are real and something. We describe the creation of the world as something from nothing, meaning that godliness is nothing, as it is not graspable, and the creations are real and something. A mystic and a philosopher were having a conversation. So a mystic and a philosopher. The mystic says to the philosopher, he says, you know what the difference between you and me is? You, Mr. Philosopher, whilst you are always thinking about God, I, the mystic, am only always thinking about myself. So the philosopher was flattered. He says, wow, that's nice. Finally, you conceded the superiority of my vocation over yours. To which the mystic explains, he says, look, to me, the mystic, I know that God exists. And I wonder all the time if I exist. That's why I'm thinking about myself. You, the philosopher, you know that you exist. And you're constantly wondering if God exists. That's why you're thinking about God all the time. I am thinking about me. We have two perspectives here at play. God is the God of minds. There's two perspectives at all times. And they are, on the one hand, the godly perspective, that we are nothing, this physical world is nothing, created from something, which is God. And our perspective, which is the exact opposite, we say that we are something, this is the philosopher, created from nothing. And right here you got the next two levels. We had the worldly reality to start off with. Beyond the worldly reality, we had the creation reality. But now we have the godly reality. And the godly reality says that the only thing that exists is God. So in order really to resolve the contradiction between the two verses we had in the beginning, that in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, and then we said that besides for God there is nothing. When we say God created the heaven and the earth, we're talking about the creation perspective. That God created us. But when we say there's nothing besides Him, that's on a deeper level of perception. That's the godly reality, the godly perception. Now, I want to see a beautiful example of this at play on page 18, where the world as we know it is constantly being created by God. It's constantly being created by God. But we don't see God creating it at all. When we see a table, what do we see? A table. We don't see the power of God creating it. But take a look what would happen if we could. If we had those X-ray vision glasses to be able to see the godly power creating the table. Look what would happen. This is from the Kabbalists. The fact that every creation and event appears to us as something and as tangible is only because we do not grasp and see with our eyes of flesh that divine energy and divine utterances within each creation. But if the eye were allowed to see and apprehend the divine reality, the divine vitality, and spiritually being infused into every creation, then the physicality, materiality, and substance of that creation would be utterly invisible to us. Imagine you would look at a person and see their soul inside. Imagine you could see a timeless soul, an infinite, godly soul. Imagine you could see that. You'd see this brilliant light. What would you notice about the person? Would you notice their fingers and toes? Would you notice the clothes they're wearing? No. Or would you notice this brilliant 10 billion watt light?
How would you see the table?
You wouldn't. So if you could see the godly force creating this table, it would be like a soul. You wouldn't see it. So it's only because we're spiritually blind. We don't see angels. We don't see energy. We don't even see cell phone waves. We don't see satellite waves. We have very, very limited vision. Scientists tell us, they know, that we don't see most of what's out there. Right? We don't see, gamma rays and microwaves and satellite waves and cellular waves. We don't see nothing. We've got a very, very limited perspective on what's actually. We can only see very limited on the spectrum, on the visual spectrum. Aren't you an optometrist?
No.
We see.
Ophthalmologist. So, do you agree with what I just said about us being able to see very limited?
See the object.
You don't want to talk to me about philosophy.
Oh, okay. Okay, I got you. All right, fine, fair. Thanks for the warning. So the fact is that we can't see most of what's out there. Imagine we were able to see the godly energy which is creating the table, or the soul which is giving life to the person. You would not see what we ordinarily see. The worldly reality says, I see a person. The creation reality says, I see a soul, or I understand that there's a soul giving life to this person. But I still see the person. But I understand that there's a soul there. The godly reality says there's only a soul, there's nothing else. Right? And from this perspective, the world is just totally turned upside down. We see reality, there's only God, and nothing else really exists. We actually are aware of this, but we in our daily prayers, we concede to this reality. We admit that there is such a thing, even though we know that we can't relate. And that's in page 19. Take a look. Now we say, Modim anachnu lach, we concede to you, meaning we concede that the truth is how it is from God's perspective. The fact that the world and all it contains appears to be real in something. This is only due to the fact that God hides himself in the constrictions and concealments. As it is written, God hides himself. It is by means of this constriction that a created thing appears to be something. And these constrictions generate the second reality. Yet the constrictions are only from our perspective. From God's perspective, the constrictions are not real at all. Hence the truth is as it is from God's perspective, which is the higher mind. Thus we say we concede. In other words, just to summarize, we said before that there's God is the God of minds. There's two realities at play. There's the creation reality and there's the godly reality. There's the way we look up and see God, and then there's the way God looks down and sees us. They're very different. They're very different views of reality. Where from a creation reality we say we exist. You'll see why they're different. From a creation reality, we say that we exist because God created us. That's from a creation reality. We say we exist but only because God created us. From a godly reality, we say there's only God. There's only God. The world is just something made into nothing. And from a godly reality, there's really nothing else. And that's why. Okay, so getting very philosophical. I hope you're okay with where we're going with this. I hope I'm not going too deep right now. Okay, I hope so. It's a little abstract. We're almost done here. We're almost done with the difficult part here. So, now we in our experience, we're familiar. We drive cars, right? We drive cars. How many of us know actually what's going on under the engine, under the hood? I have no idea what's going on over there. I don't have the foggiest idea. I just get in, I turn the key, it works, I'm happy. Right? Everything that we do has a front end and a back end. You go to the internet, you type in a website, and it loads. Beautiful. What do we know about HTML code? I don't know nothing about it. But there are, this is good, okay, here's an engineer, right? But, there's a whole bunch of different examples, if you see on page 21, with electronics and with medicine, for example. Some person came up with why this is going to cure AIDS or cancer. The person who's taking the pill is just happy to take the pill and get rid of the disease. But there's someone in the back office that actually knows what's going on over here, right? There's a front end and there's a back end. So even though these two, the creation reality and the godly reality, seem to be very much in conflict, they're actually the front end and the back end. What we see is the creation reality. We see there's a world which God created. But on the back end, there's a God who says that there's only God. We are the end user. We don't really fathom or relate to the back end. We just know that it's there. So what happens here is something fascinating happens. And this is going to tie it all together and finishes this. The creation reality and the godly reality seem to be polar opposites. From a godly reality, we are nothing from something. From a creation reality, we are something from nothing. But that verse before, which said that God is the God of mindsets or something, tells us that God created both realities, and they're both actually two versions of the same truth. Let's take a look at that on page 22. God is beyond the tzimtzumim, the self-concealments and constrictions that generate the creation reality. So there's the godly reality. And God is also the source of the constrictions, which is the creation reality. So in the end result, God includes both minds. Hence the verse states, God is the God of minds. It's not that one is right and one is wrong. It's just like a washing machine. On the outside, you see the washing machine, it's fantastic, it cleans your clothes, you're happy. But on the inside, there's that warning sign, which none of us really ever read. Right? But, when your technician comes, he's looking for it. Because he understands that there's all of that going on inside. Right? So on the front end, what we see is the creation reality. We see a world created by God. But on the back end, we know, and we concede, that there is a godly reality as well. They're not actually in conflict. They seem to be in conflict. How can they coexist? How can they be front end and back end? How can it be that the godly reality is on the inside and the creation reality is on the outside? It's two, either the world exists or the world doesn't exist. How is it possible to have them both? We can understand this when we think about how a parable works. You know what a parable is? Like a metaphor, a parable. Why do we need parables?
Helps you understand.
Helps you understand what?
Illustrate principles.
Why would you need a parable to do that? Why don't you just say the principle?
Because sometimes it's not clear.
It's too complicated.
It's too complicated. So the parable, Marty, then, will simplify the matter which is too complex. Right? The parable will simplify a matter which is too complicated. What else does it do? Why else would you need a parable?
It works with the other. So
The parable explains to you what you really need to understand, right? So, parables also serve to remove us from the emotional context of what we're talking about. King David had a man killed so he could marry his wife. Right? Right, there's a story. Right? Story. So Bathsheba, right? So King David had this man killed so he could marry his wife. Now, the prophet comes in to rebuke King David. But he doesn't come to him and he says, "You killed an innocent man, and therefore you're guilty." No. You know what he says to him? He tells him a story about a person who has many sheep. And his neighbor has only got one sheep. And a guest comes to visit the man with many sheep. So the host wants to serve him dinner. So what does he do? Instead of slaughtering one of his many sheep, he goes next door, takes the one sheep of the neighbor, and he slaughters him and he serves dinner. So the prophet asks King David, he says, "What should I rule in this case?" He doesn't tell him it's a made-up story. So King David gets really upset and he says, "What? That's not fair. The guy should be killed." "That man is you," said the prophet to King David. "You are that man. Because you're the king, you're allowed to have many wives." But the ordinary citizens of Israel, just one sheep, just one wife in the parable. Just one wife you're allowed to have. Why did you take this guy's one wife? You couldn't find someone else? She was beautiful, yeah. David concedes and he says, "You've taught me something." He says, "You've taught me something, you're right." And for the rest of his life, he was exercising repentance. You see, David would have been emotionally charged if the prophet would have come to him and said, "You sinned." Why? Because you took someone else's wife. He gave him a story which was not related. A totally different context, where David could see clearly and judge that case very clearly. And once he judged that, he said, "Oh, the same thing, you're the same ruling you reached here, you should apply to your case." That's another reason you need a parable. To remove us from the emotional attachment, prejudice of our case. And you can do the same thing with, people that are, let's say, pro-Palestinian or people that are anti-Semitic. You know that Dr. Seuss is, in many cases, a parable? The Sneetchers, I think it was called. The Star-Bellied Sneetchers, yeah. It was a whole story. This is Dr. Seuss, it's Bubba Mice, about these creatures with the stars and whatever. It was a brilliant parable to the ills of anti-Semitism, of which the author of Dr. Seuss, whose name I forget, was very much opposed to anti-Semitism, right? You can't just go to an anti-Semite and say, "What you're doing is wrong." He's going to laugh at you. But when you take him to an objective situation, you show him star-bellied sneetchers, whatever that is, and you show him the folly of it all, then he says, you know what? Maybe you got a point. Because that would be another purpose of a parable. And we find that, in biblical stories. Many of the stories of the Bible, besides for their literal interpretation, because one of the precepts of our faith is that the Bible is literal, has many layers of depth to the various stories, which is what makes my job as a rabbi so much fun, because I can never finish. There's always a new layer of depth to be uncovered and discovered, right? So you find that in Animal Farm. Remember George Orwell? What was he on about? Communism, right? All animals are created equal, and some are created more equal than others. right? You have pie charts to show how your business is doing, or line charts. The line chart is just a line. But it shows you, it's a representation without all the clutter of what's actually happening in your business, how things are going. You're up and down, you're in the red or in the black, Where are things going? So this is why we need parables. Let's apply that to our perception of reality as well. So, page 23, please. By way of example, of the case of a great sage who needs to transmit an idea to a minor student. You're trying to teach calculus to a 10-year-old whose intellect is many levels lower than that of the teacher. If the teacher were to reveal the depth and breadth of the idea as he has it, he'd blow the mind of the student, right? The student's faculties would be confused and he would not be able to receive anything at all. So the teacher needs to contract and conceal the full depth and breadth of his wisdom in this idea, and to dress it and conceal it within a parable. The parable is something that is completely foreign to the idea. So it covers it and conceals it, like a garment covers that which is in it. But it is by means of the parable that the student will grasp the idea and understand it, because the parable corresponds to the idea. So when he teaches the student a parable, he'll bring him closer to an understanding of what we're actually talking about. He's trying to teach him multiplication. So what does he do? He takes 2 apples or 4 apples, and he's playing out at the apples of the abacus, and he's able to show him how multiplication works, right? So in summary, the parable, which is originally foreign to the idea, it ultimately corresponds to the idea. It makes it relatable, and it crosses that ideological gap with which he's struggling with. It serves 3. In order to have an effective parable, you got to make sure that you're going to bring it down to the level of the student. You need to be able to know who you're talking to. You need to know your target audience, but you can't go too low. Because if you oversimplify the parable, what's going to happen? You won't even know that there's a parable. He'll just think you're teaching him about carrots. Right? You won't know that. That's why there's got to be an element of mystery in the parable. You have to have an element of mystery in the parable. Leaving something to the imagination. Like some lingering questions, right? And also, you got to make sure that it's multi-layered, right? Because that's what's going to allow the student to realize that there's further depth to be acquired. God is the ultimate parable maker. God put us in this world in order to establish a relationship with Him. But He couldn't just come up to us and say, "Hey, you, hi." Probably blow our minds, like a professor at Harvard trying to teach a 4-year-old about political science or calculus, right? So what does He do? He created this finite world to serve as a parable to a deeper reality. Remember we said there was layers? There was the worldly reality, then we said there was the creation reality, and then we said there was the godly reality. On the deepest level, highest level, we have what's called the unified reality, where we have the godly reality on the inside, like that washing machine, and on the outside we have the creation reality, where when you look at the washing machine, you say, I don't know what's going on in there, but I know that there's something going on in there. It worked to clean my clothes. The pill cured the sickness. So I know somebody knows what's going on in there. I don't. But there's something there. So in that sense, the front end serves as a parable to the back end. You follow, right? So the front end serves as a parable to the back end. So God creates this world with multiple layers of depth. So that we are born into this world and we say, hey, lollipop, lovely. Then we have a soccer ball or basketball hoop or recital or homework. We're just experiencing the world the way we know it. But then we come across the realization that there are certain mysteries within creation. If you didn't have a problem with the Holocaust over there, Marty and Mitch, right? If you didn't have a problem with the Holocaust, then there'd be nothing left to the imagination. The parable I'm not condoning the Holocaust, God forbid. But the parable leaves you with lingering questions where you realize there's deeper depth. There's mystery associated here which forces you to ask very, very important questions, very painful questions. When we're faced with challenges in our lives, the Kabbalists tell us that the purpose of these challenges is in order to force us to think deeper, to look deeper into our reality, to search, to understand, to try to understand what lies beneath the surface. There's a God out there who's trying desperately to get our attention. I like giving the analogy. Want to say something, Mitch?
Well, I'm just wondering why 6 million Jews died so we could explore a deeper reality. That seems to be what you're saying.
You can ask the same question of the 6 million. Let me just answer one question at a time. You can answer the same question of the 6 million about why one child had to die yesterday in a hospital somewhere on planet Earth. Right? The fact that it was 6 million or 1 is irrelevant to the intellectual.
Except for the 6 million.
Okay, and what about that one child? Right? So you can't exaggerate. All that you're doing by asking about the Holocaust is emotionally exaggerating the question. Again, I'm not minimizing. This is not an emotional conversation. It's cerebral, right? So if I was God, I would know the answer to that question. In an email that I sent this week, you may have noticed that it was Mengele himself, Joseph Mengele himself, who picked my grandmother out of the side of the crematoriums of Auschwitz, or the gas chambers, and he brought her to the other side. He personally sent a Nazi to bring her back. Right? I am never a proponent of the Holocaust, and I am not God's defense attorney. I would never claim to be that. I've got major problems with God myself. I'm on your side. Okay? But, so I'm not here to explain the Holocaust. But within the context of this conversation, I want you to realize that the bad things that happen to us are God trying to get our attention. Let me give you a quick example, quick story. Yes?
I take a different view, Rabbi.
Okay.
I think rather than get our attention,
Okay.
maybe he's telling us that he's not involved and we are the master of our destiny and that we're responsible for our own actions.
Without him.
Correct.
If we're responsible for our own actions, we would have gone the same way as the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, Babylonians, Phoenicians, and all the other nations that have been disappeared. We've outlived them all, Alan. There is no rational explanation as to why the Jewish people, I think it was Mark Twain who wrote this 100 years ago, who said that there's zero rational explanation why the Jewish people still walk the face of this earth. It just doesn't make any sense. Set to our own devices, we have no way to be here.
Jewish people.
Okay.
I'm talking about mankind.
Okay. Look, that might be your perspective because you, with all due respect, Alan, might be living on a worldly perspective of reality. On that first level, on a worldly reality level, which is how you view the universe.
That I appreciate the insect world, our world, a world or dimension above our world,
Right.
and the Creator, in God, and that He did all these things that we're talking about, but He maybe set us to our own destiny or our own demise, and that we're responsible for our own actions, rather than saying it was predetermined by God, or that He looks down on a billion people
To control what's going
and
on.
picks one person that will affect this world.
So let me give you an example to illustrate.
Maybe he wants us to solve the problems.
Yeah, maybe he does, and I think he does, but it's a hybrid of both. He wants our actions, God blesses those.
Right.
God will bless you in all that you do. He wants you to do, and then He blesses you. But let me give you this quick example of a story. So it's one of my favorites, but you got this successful businessman who just inked the deal of his lifetime. Not only he and his children, but his grandchildren are never going to have to work for the rest of their lives. And he tells his office, his secretary, hold my calls. He's just giddy with joy. And he's just taking a break. Doesn't tell anybody. He climbs to the top floor of his skyscraper that he just purchased now. Manhattan. And he's taking in this gorgeous view that he now owns. Beautiful. After a few moments, the wind blows and bam, the door shuts. He walks over to the door and you realize there's no handle for this door. You're not supposed to access it from the outside. So it doesn't have a handle. You can't get back in. Knocking on the door, he realizes he's 3 flights up from anybody who's going to possibly hear him. Reaches for his phone. He left it on his desk. It's getting dark. It's getting cold. He's getting nervous. So what does he do? Goes over to the edge. He's 40 floors up in the sky. And he sees little people walking down the street. So he takes out his wallet. He realizes he has a wad of $100 bills. Thank God. So what does he do? He says, now I'm going to get someone's attention. He throws them down. The $100 bills, they come down to the floor. And what does he see? People stop, pick it up, look right, look left, and they go. And he says, hey, that's my money. Nobody hears him. And he throws all the money, thousands of dollars, gone. Nothing. Now he's really in trouble. He notices a few pebbles. So what does he do? Takes a pebble, misses someone by a foot. And this guy is crying bloody murder within 5 minutes. You've got the SWAT teams up there, the police guns drawn as to why, right? Yeah. The man on the roof is God. The guy's walking down the street is you and me. Every once in a while we come across a $100 bill. And we say, hey, I'm a genius. Right? I am just such a genius. You meet your wife, you have a healthy child, you buy a beautiful house, your business is successful, your stock market is going through the roof, and you say, wow, I'm doing great. And who do you pat in the back? Yourself. And God is like, hey, you, trying to get your attention down there. And we're not even looking up in the right direction. And then he says, okay, drops a brick. Right? And then you're like, hey, why me? We all say, why me? That's the first question we all ask, right? When something bad happens, why would God do this to me? And I say to this person, I say, 1 second, did you ask why me when you sold your first business for $5 million? Did you say why me when you had your beautiful children, when you built your beautiful house? No. That was your genius, right? So, in the analogy, I say to people, the bad things that are happening to you, and I'm not condoning them, but from a Torah perspective, they are God trying to get your attention. I try to get your attention through $100 bills. I'm desperate for a relationship with you. It's not happening. So what do I need to do? I have no choice. I'm dropping a little pebble in you. Hope it doesn't hurt too much. But you look up and you say, there's more to this world than I thought. There's more than just the worldly reality. You realize the creation reality. You realize that there is the godly reality, the front end and the back end of that washing machine. And you realize that there is a God who's desperate for a relationship with us. And in this sense, we can make some meaning of the madness, of the craziness, this meshugana world that we live in. You know, you wonder, why on earth is Israel always singled out? I mean, for heaven's sake, right now, you've got literally a world war on Israel's doorstep about Israel. It's all about Israel. The Iranians, I don't know where the Russians fit in. I'm no political scientist, but I know the Iranians, and we all know why they're there. The Syrians, we know what they're trying to do. We know Gaza border, we know what's trying to happen over there, Hamas. And we're on a little baby Israel. It's like a little sliver of land. What is going on over here? Right? Why? That's on a cosmic level, on a global level. And then on a personal level, you think about the problems in your life right now. Think about those challenges. From a Kabbalistic perspective, when we recognize what we've learned here today, when we recognize that when we challenge ourselves to think about if the world really exists, when we really ask ourselves this question, we say, hey, on a molecular level, it's hard to say that the world is a constant, that the world is an absolute value. You say, there's only absolute value is really God. And then there's that creation reality where I exist and there's also God. And then there's the godly reality where there's only God and the world doesn't really exist. Something from nothing, nothing from something, right? That whole thing. And you realize when bad things happen, people turn to the rabbi. They turn to spiritual counseling. They say that the angel of death, the Malach HaMovis, is the one who feeds the synagogues. You ever heard of that one? Why does the angel of death feed the synagogues? Someone passes away. When he takes a client and they come to Shul to say Kaddish. When bad things happen, that's when people find spirituality. Because God is trying to... is trying to get our attention. It's our daily challenges and opportunities from this perspective that take on a whole new significance. When we ask ourselves, why does it have to be so hard? Kabbalah tells us the reason why things are happening the way they are is because God wants us to deepen our perception of ourselves, of reality, and of Him and His existence, because He craves a relationship like you would crave a relationship with your child who refuses to acknowledge that he has a mother. Right? Imagine your child refuses to acknowledge that he has a mother or a father. How would you react to that? Maybe you cut the credit card? Maybe then you'll get a phone call? Right? Maybe, right? Maybe you cut the Medicare, the medical insurance. Maybe you cut the car insurance, right? Suddenly you start getting notices in the mail and they say, hey, Dad, what happened? You're like, oh, now I got your attention. Thank you very much, right? It's interesting. The word for challenge in Hebrew is mashbel. Mashbel also means a birthing stool. A birthing stool. You give birth. Why is a challenge a birthing stool? Same word in Hebrew. Because challenges, according to some, are the end of the road. But from a Kabbalistic perspective, challenges are the birth of deeper realities, of deeper perceptions, of deeper relationships. Take a look at the figure on page 29, please. Sheesh, it's noisy here today. Whew.
I went and I told them.
Oh, you told them. Thank you. Thank you. Page 29. Can you see, what do you see there? Anybody can tell what you see in this picture? Anybody know what they see there?
Yeah.
What do you see?
Person on the left reaching out to someone on the right.
Anybody else? Any other ideas?
Looks like two animals. I see a baby in utero.
A baby in utero. Wow. Whenever the doctors show us the OBGYN, they show us the images of the baby in utero, they say, oh, it's a male, and oh, these are the toes. I'm like, how do you know a toe from a nose? I have no idea. But okay.
I see a shofar with a hand.
A shofar with a hand. Somebody said an animal. Who said an animal? Well, what kind of animal you see? What? A turtle. Oh, a turtle. We got a turtle. Where's the turtle? I think you're holding it upside down. No, I'm joking.
A bear.
A bear. Okay, sees a bear. Well, can you turn over the page to 235? No, page 235. I'm sorry, page 235. Yeah, we tricked you. We put it at the back. 235. Oh, you said a cow. I didn't hear you. Good, okay. Page 235. You see the cow? There's one track minded you. Okay, so page 230. Oh, you might not have it if you only have the printouts. You wouldn't have it if you only have the printout. On page 235, you'll see that there's you have the person next to you show you if you don't have the book. You basically see a cow, the outline of a cow. It's next to a fence. There's a cow next to a fence. This is a famous example. Yikes. This is a famous example of something called hiding in plain sight. When you go back, it's a famous example. Go back to the original picture. When you go back to the original picture now, you look at it, you say, yeah, I do see the two eyes, I see the ears. Yeah, pretty good actually. I'm seeing it pretty well right now. I see the snout. It's a cow standing next to a fence. Right? When you know what the answer is, it's then that you look at it and you say, oh, there's nothing hiding here. I know exactly what's going on over here. Right? You see exactly what's going on. That's what happens when we deepen our perception of reality. When the challenges and struggles and crises, when the crisis of our lives force us to deepen our perception of reality, it's then that we start seeing the cow. It's then that we start seeing the presence of God, which is right under our noses. We're living in a world that Alan described, a world which is fatalistic, deterministic, a world where you have to fend for yourself and the survival of the fittest. But then, when you have a crisis in your life, and God forbid somebody's very sick, and you turn to the rabbi, you're late to tefillin, you fly to New York to go to the Rebbe's graveside to pray, something you would never have done before. You do this now, and suddenly you start to discover God. You start to discover a sense of faith within yourself. Now when you start looking at the world around you, you start seeing the same world. It's the same picture. But now you see the outline. Now you know that there's the hidden hand of God within this picture. And what that does is it completely transforms our perception of reality. That's what happens, yeah.
I also think that gratitude, being grateful,
Right?
and being consciously grateful,
Yeah.
will take you from the worldly level to a higher level.
The gratitude. Yeah, sometimes it's the $100 bills that get the attention. Sometimes when the $100 bill falls upon you, people look up and they say, thank you, God. But sometimes if that doesn't work, then they need the pebbles or maybe a brick, right, to get their attention, right? In that analogy. So let's sum it up on the screen here a second. So we start over the worldly reality. We say, is the world real? From a worldly reality, we say, yep, there are hard and fast limits to this world. The world is absolutely real. From a worldly reality, this is where we all start off. No problem. Then we brought in the creation reality. God created the world, and God created, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We said, yep, the world exists only because God willed it so. That's nice of Him to do so, but the world certainly exists. Then we said, from a godly reality, which is the flip side, the back end of the creation reality, the inner view, the insider's view. From a godly reality, we say that you are God alone and there's nothing else besides you. There really is nothing else out there. There's no real world. Here, Cheli, come on over, girl. And everybody say hello to my daughters, please. 2 daughters, Cheli and Eti. Hey, girls. And 2, just number 2 and number 4. Yeah, hey, Eti, how you doing? Yeah, how you doing, bro? So from a godly reality, we say that the world really does not exist. From God's perspective, we are nothing created from something. And then we have the unified reality. From the unified reality, there we say the world is real because it is a parable. It is the front end of the secrets that He wants us to know in the back end. It communicates a divine reality. It communicates the relationship that He so desperately wants us to have with Him. And therefore, when we experience challenges, they are what rip open the facade and enable us to discover the truth of God in the workings of creation. So you see, we tearing open the wallpaper and we're able to see what lies underneath.
We tend to...
What? Sorry, what?
I was going to say,
Yeah.
we tend to believe in God when we want it to solve a problem for us.
Right?
I like an example of
When we're in trouble.
I rented a car.
Yeah?
I had an accident. I rented a car, and when I opened the door real wide, it hit another car.
Right.
And left a big black mark
Ouch.
on the car. And I said, oh my God, when I go back to give the car, they're going to charge me. So I said, oh, please, God, let me solve this problem. So I went in and got a car wipe, and I brushed it off. I solved my problem. But we tend to think of God when we want help.
That's right. But if we're smart, we'll remember to find God through gratitude, through the good times, and then He won't need to send us the bad times to get our attention. The question is, how mindful can we be? How present can we be in the world that we live in to be able to see more than just what meets the eye, to realize that there's that which lies beneath the surface. You've got to be a fool to think that a washing machine is only what you see. To think that a pill is just a piece of whiteness. Right? You got to realize that there's something going on in the back. When you see the world too, you realize that there's a designer, there's a creator, there's a whole relationship going on. And this might take us a lifetime. The interpretation of this parable might take us the rest of our lives. But when we do, it's worth it. Because that relationship which we will develop is the purpose for which we were placed in this world. I just want to summarize with you the key points on page 30. If we could just review quickly. We started off 6 key points. We started off with a question. Is the world real? We said as 4 different answers because there are 4 different perspectives on reality. The worldly reality, the creation reality, the godly reality, and the unified reality. 2, from the perspective of the worldly reality, the world is real because its limitations are real and immutable. This leads to the conclusion that success in life depends on learning effective strategies within the dictates of nature and society. That's what Alan, exactly what you were talking about. That's how we survive, by just being good at what we do. But 3, from the perspective of the creation reality, the world and the laws that govern it are real, not because they possess any inherent reality of their own, but only because God created them, and they exist solely to serve God's purpose in creation. 4, the divine act of creation is commonly described as something from nothing, because the world is definitive, intangible something, and God is infinite and intangible nothing to our finite minds. But from the perspective of the godly reality, the opposite is true. The world is nothing from something, as its finite and conditional existence is nothing in comparison to the infinite and absolute divine reality. 5, the unified reality reveals that the creation reality and the godly reality are two sides of the same truth. In the same way that a parable is only a finite and digestible incarnation of the abstract concept it communicates, the world therefore is real because it communicates the reality of God. And finally, number 6, the moral and spiritual challenges that the world presents to us are plot twists in the parable, woven into it to empower us to discover the truth of God in the workings of creation. If nothing else today, if we've been able to reinterpret the painful challenges that come our way, again, without minimizing, mitigating, or condoning or justifying the challenges that we face as a people or as individuals, but if only to give us a perspective that God has created a parable because He wants to get a relationship with us. He can't do it with a full frontal attack. He's got to do it through parables and metaphors to get our attention slowly. And those challenges are God is seeking our attention. Instead of running to the bank to solve your problem, maybe we need to look upwards whenever we have a problem, whether it's medical, political, military, emotional, relationships, whatever your problem is. Hopefully a deepened awareness of the Kabbalistic root of challenges and crises as a birthing stool will allow us to appreciate the multi-layered depth within the parable, how God is craving for us to appreciate and realize and recognize Him on the godly reality level. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us here today. If you would like to have a textbook, we need to order them tomorrow, so please let Ashley know. She's at the back to sign up for the course. But if you have any questions, please anybody, go ahead. I would love to take your questions. Thank you very much.